Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. So this week we're looking at Chapter 8. I have a lot to cover. I hope to make it snappy. And I also want to cover the quiz, so I'll try to weave that in or do it at the end, but I want to get through this as quickly as possible. So it's Chapter 8. It's week 9. I hope you all enjoyed your spring break if you went somewhere. And if you didn't go somewhere, I still hope you enjoyed your spring break. So there's nothing wrong with staying at home, especially when everything costs so much. So anyway, that aside, let's get into Chapter 8. It's a biggie because it really takes us to current day already. And I mean, some of the problems with the way this book is laid out that, I like everything to kind of flow in, from, date A to the end, but it's not the way this book is really laid out. It really, when it gets to the end, it kind of starts to break stuff up by topic a little bit more. So, but this one is supposed to take us from 1945 to current day, and it's not going to. So some of the upcoming chapters, I'll kind of talk more about the more popular culture aspects of the Western world. But this chapter is all about the Western side, the other side of the globe. So we've been over in Europe, we've been in Asia, we've been everywhere, and now we're coming back here to Latin America, North America, South America is mentioned in this chapter, and Canada, of course. So kind of let's get into that. The U.S. since 1945 is impossible to cover in a third of a chapter. It's impossible to cover in a 15-week course, let alone trying to cover it in about 5 or 6 minutes in an online video. So, obviously the biggies here, and let me just kind of go through the book. One of the real biggies is the Great Society, and I think about that because I see this picture of Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, in the book that we're looking at on the screen right now, and there's a little note under there that in 1964, actually just up north in Ann Arbor, 40 minutes away, Johnson gives the speech, the Great Society speech, and it really talks about his plans to work on social problems. Particularly civil rights, poverty, Medicare, Medicaid, all of these social programs are either created or enhanced under the Johnson administration. So the Great Society is all about this idea that government, or about this debate actually, is, why is government here? What is government supposed to do for us? Is it supposed to be hands-off with very little taxes and very little services? Or is it supposed to be hands-on, where the government is seen in a role that really kind of takes care of people? And really, if you look at this period of time that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks, when it comes to the U.S., we talked about the New Deal under Roosevelt and what a huge change that was from the Hoover administration, who was very conservative. So Roosevelt really started this idea of big spending on social programs, and it continued under Truman, who actually worked for national health insurance but couldn't get it done. And then we get to Eisenhower when we get into this chapter, and a much more conservative guy when it comes to social programs, but really wasn't. I guess Eisenhower's candidacy or presidency could be more summarized by a presidency of defense. It's in the height of the Cold War. He's a warrior. There's a lot of spending on defense going on and developing our nuclear arsenal, developing NORAD and some of these other programs. So this political debate that still goes on today between the Democrats and the Republicans about, what's the role of society? Are we here to, is government's role in society here to help, to intervene, or is it supposed to be hands-off? And that debate is certainly going on in this chapter like it's going on today. So, one of the takeaways from the chapter is that we start out with this idea of these big social programs, the subcategories in this chapter, an era of prosperity. Yeah, for sure. After World War II, the economy boomed. It was the baby boom. I was born right in the middle of it in 1957, and things were great guns. Things were just going crazy as far as the economy here, industrial growth. Detroit was cranking out cars. We were still making TVs and making steel here. So, the U.S. was doing really well as far as the economy goes during this era. Of course, the social programs, all right? So the big one is civil rights. And again, one of the things I think the book does in the calendar at the end of the chapter is it kind of implies that the civil rights movement started in 1955. And I guess maybe the MLK part does. but really the civil rights movement in some way, shape, or form had been going on long before 1955. But in this chapter, these were the biggies. So you have to know what the Brown v. Board of Education decision was in 1954. So that was the decision that was the court decision that desegregated schools. So that was huge, and that was in 1950. So again, in the middle of these ideas about the Great Society, which come to light in the early 60s, there's stuff going on in the 50s that's really important, and actually under the Truman administration that's really important for civil rights also. But Brown v. Board of Ed is a big thing, so make sure you know about that. Read about the focus on civil rights and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I wish we had more time to cover civil rights in the South during this era, but we don't. But I think the book does a pretty good job of summarizing Martin Luther King's life and his ideas as far as peaceful protest goes and furthering the cause of civil rights. And the I Have a Dream speech they talk about in here, it's a biggie. If you haven't yet, go out on the internet and listen to it or listen to parts of it. It's very inspirational. If you haven't been to Washington yet, go and stand in the footsteps of where this happened. It's a great experience, and there's a lot to learn there. So read about that, and let me just kind of go through the book. Nixon and Watergate, so that's another big section. So I don't understand Watergate, only because the Republicans were doing pretty well, and so Watergate, what happened was Nixon gets elected. He's in office. He's a Republican, right? And nothing like today's Republicans, love him or hate him. He was really an environmental president. I mean, started the EPA. I mean, Republicans today want to cut the EPA, so the party's changed a little bit. But he really was an environmentalist, and he was a strange guy. He was a Cold War warrior, but he did a lot of great things. I mean, he sort of normalized relations with China, and so that was a big thing. But before he was reelected for his second term, during that reelection period, he was a very paranoid guy, and he thought he was going to lose, even though he had overwhelming public support as far as the polls go. And one thing comes to another, and he develops a plan with his henchmen that they're going to break into the Democratic National Headquarters, which is housed in the Watergate building in Washington. That's how it gets its name, and steal campaign secrets to make sure they can win the election. And he gets caught. And he's the first president to ever resign while he's in office because he's caught red-handed. And it's hard to figure that one out, because if he would have just gone through the election, honestly, he would have won it anyway. But anyway, that's another story. But America Shifts to the Right is this subcategory in the chapter. Again, it's this idea that political polarization that's going on today was going on back then also, and really starts because you come off of this. Eisenhower was president, kind of conservative, but really more into military. And then you had Kennedy elected, and he was the first Democrat. He was a lot different. He was very liberal again. And then after his assassination, you have Johnson, who again is a Democrat, which is unusual because he's from this very conservative area of Texas. But he's a great social program guy, and so the U.S. went from liberal Democrat a little bit to conservative under Eisenhower, back to liberal under Kennedy and Johnson, and now this shift to the right under Nixon. So that's a significant part of this chapter as far as politics are concerned. I know I'm going on 10 minutes. The oil crisis is in here. So Jimmy Carter, as I speak, is in hospice care, but still alive. But under the Carter administration, which was a switch back to Democrats again as a reaction to Watergate, is the first energy crisis and the Arab oil embargoes and all of that stuff. And I remember when I started driving, gas was 30 cents a gallon. Seriously. And after this this first oil crisis, right around the time I got my license, it went up to like 70 cents overnight, which was like a huge deal now. Nothing like the $3 or $4 that we sometimes pay now. So anyway, oil crisis is happening. Let me go through this quickly. Terrorism, okay, so this chapter goes all the way to 2001 and the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center. So obviously these global issues with the U.S., and we have Obama coming into office, which is obviously a huge deal because he's the first African American to be elected to the presidency in '08. I was at his inauguration in Washington, D.C., and it was amazing. Highlight of my life. So it was very cool to be there for that. So, but then the reaction to Obama and sort of the more liberals in office, and really, from Clinton also, is this reaction from the right, the formation of the Tea Party, and which is really the Tea Party's against this idea of tax and spend politics and liberal policies as far as gay marriage is concerned, and liberal policies as far as abortions are concerned. So one of the themes we see running all through this chapter, all through American history, actually, there's the secret, are these political swings, right and left, tax, don't tax, help society, don't help society, so on and so forth. So this country is still trying to figure out what we are, but it's a good thing because it's an experiment, and if you have confidence in it and go out and vote, it works. So that's my speech there. The changing face of American society. So again, it kind of talks about all the stuff that's going on in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I lived through all of it. Okay, including the 60s. I was an undergrad in the 1970s. It was a crazy, wild time. But I think one of the things that I don't like about this chapter is that he talks about American culture and music and art, and he never really talks about rock and roll. And I mean, what a huge change, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the rise of rock and roll, the rise of drug culture, just so many things have changed in such a great way. The technology alone, the internet, I mean, come on, none of this stuff was around, but in this chapter, it all comes into play. And we're going to talk more about that at the very end of the class. But again, what's going on here in this country is amazing. This chapter goes all the way to Trump's election, so it doesn't cover Biden, but that's where it goes. So, I mean, you have lived in that. The other thing before we get out of this chapter that I just want to talk about, sort of the legacies of this chapter. The one thing when I talked about Eisenhower, one of the legacies out of this period, besides rock and roll, besides the internet, is the interstate highway system. So keep that in mind. I think that's a pretty cool thing because we drive on it almost every day. And it was Eisenhower who planned the interstate highway system as a part of our defense program so we could move military equipment across the country quickly because he saw the Autobahns in Germany that were built for that purpose and knew that we didn't have anything like that in the U.S. So the interstate highway system, like when you go over bridges and stuff on the turnpike, those are all designed to handle military-sized vehicles. All the specs on the bridges, the weight loads, the height, all that stuff is designed around military specs. So our military vehicles can get where they need to be on our interstate highway system. So kind of a fun little thing to talk about there. Again, I could spend 2 semesters on just Cold War stuff alone because it's kind of fun, including the internet and the ARPANET and all of that stuff. All of those technologies came out of Cold War paranoia, actually, to develop stuff. So going on with the chapter, it talks about sexual equality. So read about that, read about Betty Friedan, read about the feminist movement, and as we go through the quiz, I think there are some questions there. So again, it talks about women's lib, talks about the environment. So one of the quiz questions I know up front is going to ask you about, right here, this book, Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carlson, and she wrote it in 1962. And a lot of people think that it certainly was an important a book because it brought awareness of environmental issues to the forefront of American news, American culture. So it certainly was instrumental as a spark that started the environmental movement. Know that for the quiz, because that's one of the quiz questions that I can remember off the top of my head. The other thing that really kind of happened, this published in 62, but in the later 60s, acid rain was discovered in the eastern Appalachian Mountains, out east, northeast. So sort of the environmental movement starts at that time, and the formation of the EPA under Nixon, a Republican. So concerns for the environment are big. The DDT, the chemical DDT, you'll read about it in here, was really banned based on what Rachel Carson observed and wrote about. So know who Rachel Carson is. That is important for the quiz. And let's kind of go through here. I'm at 15 minutes, and I don't want to take much more of your time. I can't possibly cover all the science and technology that's happened in the U.S. since 1945. I can summarize it, though. We landed on the moon, okay, back in the 60s, in 69. All right, with technology. I mean, there's more technology in my Apple Watch now than there was on the Apollo mission. So we landed on the moon. That was huge. Russia, the first people in space with Sputnik. That was huge. What else did we do? We did the internet. That was kind of big. All right, and all of the modern communication systems, all the modern weapon systems that have been developed, microwave communications, fiber optics. The refinement of really electricity and electric generation through nuclear power. Obviously, there's been a lot of cool stuff. Like, I left out 99% of it. Those were just the biggies. But again, science and technology has been huge. And don't forget medical technology during this period of time. Really, everything that we depend on now, the CT scans and all of that stuff was invented during this period of time. I mean, vaccines, all of the vaccines, you can't even imagine. Penicillin was invented in this period of time. So this is a really hard chapter to cover in just a few paragraphs. But it was crazy. And the economy, during most of my lifetime, being born in the mid-50s, was just going great guns also, up until the 70s pretty much. So there you go on that. Let me keep going. Art and architecture, new concepts in music. I think this is a great reflection on how conservative the author of our book is, because he talks about music here, and he never spends hardly any time on rock and roll. It's absolutely crazy, but you guys know about it, and so go ahead and read through his take. And then he talks about Canada and talks about all of the great industrial development in Canada. And I think one of the big things as you think about Canada is that, and maybe a lot of us don't think about it, is that they're an incredible strategic partner as far as NORAD goes. NORAD was developed with Canada. NORAD is the North American Air Defense System. Is based, the headquarters is in Colorado. But really, like the Chinese spy balloon that came across a few weeks ago, I mean, they spotted it first up there. So Canada is an important partner from an industrial standpoint, and also from a defense standpoint and a technology standpoint. And I just want to mention really quick, you'll read a little bit in there about the movement for Quebec to separate from Canada, which I think there were 2 votes during this chapter. And the only reason I bring it up is because that's an example of a classic example of nationalism based on language and customs. And it's even called the Quebec nationalist movement. And it's relevant to this class because we talked about nationalism before and what kind of force it is. So the Quebec nationalist movement, is my understanding, has kind of died down a little bit since this chapter was written. But be aware of it, because I think it's a good thing to know. And then finally, the chapter starts to talk about Brazil and also Latin America. As far as Latin America and Mexico is concerned, and as far as the economies, know that current day and really maybe back 20, 30 years, that China has been a big investor in Latin America and in Mexico, and that's on the quiz, so make sure you know that as you read through this. And you're also going to read about, the communist movements coming into Latin America, coming into Mexico, taking over Cuba in the 1950s, and what a shock that was to the U.S., especially in the case of Cuba under Castro. So I'm going on 20 minutes. Let me finish up the quiz really quick. We talked about Silent Spring, and that was Rachel Carson, so you know about that one. Let's see. There's a question about racial desegregation and the Cold War, and how is that related? And so make sure you're familiar with really the Cold War and this idea that Russia was kind of saying to us, "Hey, if your society's so great, why do you have all these race problems?" So the idea of civil rights was certainly motivated by civil rights leaders and civil rights movements, but the pressure of the Cold War and the fact that we were under a microscope certainly had something to do with it as well. And so when you read about Brown v. Board of Ed, which was desegregation, right? It was really related to the Cold War. Many parts of the civil rights movement were. So make sure you're familiar with that. There's a question about Betty Friedan on the quiz. Make sure you know who she is. You can figure that out on your own. There's a question about these Chinese investments in Latin America and how they stimulated the economy in Latin America. So make sure you know that. And then finally, the last Cold War question was about the space program and about McCarthyism, which we didn't cover. So read about McCarthyism in the book. Make sure you're familiar with the reasons for the emergence of the space program and why NASA came to play during this period of time and how that was related to the Cold War as well. So I'm so sorry I've gone 21 minutes, but I think I covered everything. If you have any questions, let me know. Be safe, and I'll talk to you again next week. Take care now. Bye-bye.